Tens. Today we will be talking about bioaccumulation and invasive species. So to start, we're going to talk about bioaccumulation. So bioaccumulation is a process in which materials, especially toxins, are ingested by an organism at a greater rate than they are eliminated. So this is looking at one specific individual. So what it takes in remains in the organism and isn't fully expelled through respiration, metabolism, and egestion and growth. Compared to biomagnification, which is an increase of the concentration of a toxin as it moves from one trophic level to the next. So here's an example. So PCBs are released from multiple sources, industrial usually. They are absorbed by phytoplankton. So each zooplankton eats many phytoplankton. So it goes from one molecule of PCB to two, and then the zooplankton gets eaten by a herring, and then it moves up the food chain until finally the higher up the trophic level you go, the higher concentration of toxins appear. So we're going to talk about two examples, and we're going to start with DDT, or dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, which was an agricultural insecticide, so it was sprayed on crops to kill the bugs. And the excess DDT would enter waterways. Biomagnification of DDT ended up causing predatory birds to lay very thin eggshells, and as a result, the baby birds wouldn't live, or they would have all kinds of birth defects, things like that. And as a result, the bird populations dropped dramatically. And as a result, DDT was banned in 1972. However, the predatory bird populations still haven't quite recovered from pre-DDT times. As you can see, similarly, starts in the water, comes from industry, in this case agriculture, and then it moves up the food chain, and it bioaccumulates in the osprey, and that's where we're seeing the effects. So you can see in the water, the amount of DDT is pretty negligible, but then as we move up the food chain, it bioaccumulates. So mercury is a heavy metal capable of passing through the blood-brain barrier, affecting the central nervous system. In humans, mercury poisoning is passed along during pregnancy. Mercury poisoning can lead to severe neurological complications. So again, moving from industrial pollution into the food chain, and then the higher up the food chain you go, the more mercury you'll find in the fish. So that's why pregnant women are advised to avoid eating fish during pregnancy, especially high trophic level fish. So mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows First Nation. So between 1962 and 1970, over 9,000 kilograms of mercury had been illegally dumped into the Wabigoon English River system by the Dryden Chemical Company. Members of Grassy Narrow First Nation rely on the river as a source of food and water. So Grassy Narrows First Nation is located northeast of Kenora, along the river system. They heavily rely on fish as a food source, and they also got their water from the river. And then beginning in the 1960s, members of the community began showing symptoms of mercury poisoning, And today, approximately 90% of the population at Grassy Narrows First Nation suffer from mercury poisoning, and many suffer from neurological complications such as numbness, seizures, and cognitive delays. It is a huge problem that is still affecting the community. You can see here, there's signs like this all over the place. People aren't allowed to fish and eat traditional foods, and it's just led to many, many complications in the community. So now we're going to shift and we're going to talk about invasive species. So an invasive species is a species that is introduced into a new ecosystem. Typically, if you just put a species in a new ecosystem, it'll just die off. It won't be able to adapt and survive. But there are 3 levels to describe a species that is able to survive in the ecosystem. So an introduced species can survive for a while. It broke the geographic barrier, but it will not reproduce. So it is able to go into a new area, but it won't produce any offspring. An established species can reproduce, but at a regular rate. An invasive species disperses well and reproduces rapidly. Because there are no natural predators for an invasive species in an environment, it can outcompete with the native species because nothing is trying to eat it. So it can just use up all the resources it wants without having to worry about avoiding predators. So the spread of invasive species usually involves humans, whether that be accidental or intentional. So some examples of intentional release include for the use in agriculture, we're going to talk about an example in a couple slides, or aquaculture. For example, when Mr. Stadnick talked about salmon aquaculture off the coast of BC, recreational fishing and hunting. Sometimes species are released into an ecosystem solely for hunting and fishing. Carp is a good example of that, and then it eventually became invasive. Biological controls. So releasing a species into an environment to control another species, and then that species that was introduced ends up becoming invasive. Erosion control. So planting new plants in an ecosystem to control soil erosion, and then that plant just becomes invasive. And ornamental garden plants. So for example, here we have purple loosestrife, which is not native to here, but you may notice it growing all over the place, especially if you drive towards Ontario. You'll notice a lot of it growing along the Trans-Canada Highway. And it started in Manitoba and Western Ontario as a pretty garden plant, and then it grew out of control. So now this photo is blurry, but this is all purple loosestrife, and it is slowly taking over native boreal ecosystems. So we're going to talk about some examples. So we're going to talk about zebra mussels, Asian lady beetles, and the Burmese python. So zebra mussels are a bivalve freshwater mussel. They have a very hard exterior. They are a filter feeder. An individual the size of a quarter filters 1 liter of water a day, or 1 regular size Nalgene bottle. They have a high rate of reproduction, and a female is able to lay 2 million eggs annually, which is wild. So a bit more about them being filter feeders. So they eat, well, they will suck in the water, and then they act as a filter, and they'll collect all of the tiny little algal and other species that are living in the water. So they originated from waterways in South Ukraine and Russia. There, they do have a natural predator, so there is something that eats them. So they're not as widespread as they are here. They were accidentally brought over to the Great Lakes on freight ships, and they were transferred to Lake Winnipeg in approximately 2013 when they started to grow out of control. Reproduce out of control. And this is entirely done by humans because zebra mussels are only able to travel upstream. So you may have noticed in the last few years the province has been putting out these invasive species posters and media all over the place advertising the Clean, Drain, Dry program to stop the spread of zebra mussels. As you can see here, this is something, maybe an anchor? I'm not sure what this is, but it was taken out of the water and you can see it is clearly covered in zebra mussels. They reproduce like crazy. And the tiny little ones, they are so small that they feel like sand stuck to things. So some of the consequences of zebra mussels in Lake Winnipeg, they outcompete native species. So you can see here there is a native species of mussel, and the zebra mussels have essentially suffocated it. And this is pretty common. They ruin infrastructure, so you can see here. So imagine if zebra mussels got into a pipe. The pipe would be completely ruined, and they are super, super hard to pry off of the surface. They're visually unappealing. Here's a picture. I believe this is Grand Beach. I'm not sure, but regardless, they're not nice to look at. They're bad for recreation, so they're very, very sharp. Not fun to walk on. You will get cut, so that ruins tourism opportunities. And they are very, very expensive to clean up because A, they are hard to remove off of surfaces, and B, they reproduce so rapidly. One positive, which does not outweigh the negatives, mind you, is that because they are filter feeders and they are so numerous right now, that the water clarity in Lake Winnipeg has actually slightly improved. So next we're going to talk a little bit about Asian lady beetles. So they were introduced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture between 1960 and 1990 to control aphid populations on field crops. So there were an abundance of aphids on, I believe it was apple and pecan crops. So these lady beetles were introduced to control those populations, but the population of beetles grew out of control and they've slowly moved north. You may notice them around now as it gets a little bit warmer. They're typically attracted to indoor locations, so they like congregating on human-built structures. They're very aggressive compared to the native species of ladybug, and they outcompete with the native species, which isn't good for the natural ecosystem. They can be controlled using chemicals and other means like that. And you can tell the difference between a native ladybug and the Asian lady beetle. If you look at the head, the Asian lady beetle has this little M marker, whereas a native ladybug does not. So we're going to talk about the Burmese python. So a few decades ago, the Burmese python was a very popular pet, particularly in Florida, and people would often get them and completely underestimate the level of care it took to look after one of these snakes. So what happened was a lot of people just released them into the wild. They thought they were doing the snake a favor. Well, nope. Unfortunately, the Burmese python has kind of taken over some ecosystems in Florida, like the Everglade habitats in this photo. They don't have any natural predators, and the only competition for food in these areas would be like an alligator. But alligators can't climb trees, so the python actually um, is the better competitor in this case. They wipe out a lot of species in these areas. I read an article that there was one python that was found to have 3 deer inside of it. Like, what? 3 deer? Um, yeah, so to control the population, the government in Florida has started to allow people to purchase licenses to sport hunt pythons. So I don't know if hunting's up your alley and you want to try something new. Maybe check out possibly going to Florida and hunting some pythons. So finally, just kind of something fun to end on today. Iguanas, also in Florida. Florida is pretty temperate. It's pretty nice all year round, so it's kind of a breeding ground for invasive species, unfortunately. So iguanas are also invasive in Florida, but this uh, was an interesting event that happened kind of recently. So in January, I believe it was the 20th of January this year, temperatures dipped below 5 degrees Celsius, which was kind of unusual. And so there were all of these iguanas all over the place. And because iguanas are cold blooded, their bodies can't handle that. So there were all of ththese iguanas. They were just falling out of trees, and the news had to issue a warning to watch out for falling iguanas, which is kind of funny. Most of the iguanas, once the weather warmed up, they were fine. Nothing to worry about. They didn't die. But yeah, just kind of interesting. Falling iguanas. Iguanas falling out of trees. And then, so finally, the questions for today. What is biomagnification? What issue is Grassy Narrows First Nation dealing with? What is the cause and the outcome? And, oh, that's supposed to say question 3. You are a farmer and you notice your neighbor has purple loosestrife growing on their property. What do you do?